All right, so here we are one day before the exam, 463,000 slides to go. It feels like it, at least. What we're going to do today is we're actually going to talk really about three things. We're going to talk about graded potentials, we're going to talk about action potentials, and we're going to talk about how graded potentials result in action potentials and how action potentials result in graded potentials across the synapse. So what we have here is kind of a loop. And you recall what we were talking about before we left is we were kind of setting up this signaling pathway, this electrical pathway, talking about the neuron and setting up all the mechanisms that are going to be taking place over today. Now, just want to remind you that the flow of ions is going to be dependent upon electrical chemical gradient. All right. Potassium is the ion that generally moves out of a cell. Sodium, chlorine, calcium generally moves into a cell. Now, we're going to be focusing primarily on potassium and sodium and less on the other two, but know that in the future we might come across things that deal with calcium and chlorine, so just know which direction they go into the cell. Potassium is the weird one. Now, there are two different types of membrane potential changes that we're going to be focusing on. One's called the graded potential, one is called the action potential, and this little slide right here summarizes the differences between the two, even though it uses language that you don't necessarily understand. All right? So first off, graded potentials have varying strengths. In other words, the magnitude of a graded potential is dependent upon the magnitude of the stimulus. All right? They can be strong, they can be weak, they can be long, they can be short. So the duration is also something that can actually be differentiated or is unique about this. The thing about a graded potential, and remember, we're just thinking this is a term that describes something that we're going to look at. The graded potential also is what we refer to as a short-term signal or short-distance signal. It only travels a very short distance across a cell before it becomes diminished or weak. It kind of fades away. The thing, though, is that the graded potential is what gives rise to our action potential. There we go. All right. If the graded potential is strong enough, ultimately it can result in an action potential. And what's unique about the action potential is that it's basically the opposite of everything I just described. It's a very brief but a very large depolarization event. And this large depolarization event is something that never diminishes in strength. It doesn't have varying degrees of magnitude. It's one size fits all. All right? Now, action potentials are things that serve as long-distance signals. They travel the full length of the cell, depending on how long the cell is. And as I described, you have, for example, nerve fibers that travel down your arm from your spinal cord all the way down to your pinky. That's the length of one cell. And so an action potential would serve as a signal to go from one side of that cell all the way to the other. All right? And so they serve as very rapid signals that can travel long distances. Now, just to put this into perspective, just so you recognize this, if you step on a tack, do you think that's important information for you to know? Yes. So you want that information to go from where that tack has penetrated through the bottom of your foot up to the nervous system so it can make a decision on what you should do and send that information back very quickly. And this is the job of the action potential. Now, we're going to start with the graded potential. And remember what we said, it's a local signal. And so what this is a local disturbance or a local change in membrane potential. And because it occurs at varying degrees, it's going to be dependent upon the strength of the stimulus that starts it. Now, what I like to do when I talk about these potentials, I like to use demonstration. And so we're going to start the wave here. Ready? Let's do the wave. Do you see how far that goes? Not very. Pretty weak sauce. That's a graded potential. It didn't travel very far. I mean, we had some good participants in the back. Good job. But for the most part, it was kind of weak sauce. It just kind of petered out. And, you know, over there on the periphery, you guys didn't care. You're like, oh, he'll never look over here. All right? That's kind of what a graded potential does. And you can see here is that the point at which we get a stimulus, and whatever the stimulus is, we'll get to that in just a moment. That point is the triggering event. And what happens is, and at least in this case, is we're going to allow sodium to come into the cell, and then that sodium results in a membrane potential change as the sodium travels away from the site of that triggering event. Much like everyone was kind of doing the wave from the triggering event when I stood in the front, it kind of moved out and away from that single point. All right? Now, the stronger the triggering event, the more channels you're going to open. The more channels you open, the more sodium comes in. The more sodium that comes in, the stronger the change in the potential. Now, what type of gates are you opening? Well, it depends on the type of stimulus. If you look up at light, you can see the light, or you can look around the room and you can see different things in the room. That's light penetrating through and activating a particular type of channel. All right? When you poke your finger with a needle, that would be mechanical. Actually, the light penetrating would be radiation type of energy, so it's kind of specific. But if you taste a piece of candy, chocolate, and we'll talk about something that we all enjoy, chocolate. All right, when that chemical touches your taste bud, in order for what gives you that pleasure, that sense of chocolate, is that you've opened up a chemical gated channel. All right, you touch a hot stove, lift your hand up, that's a thermally gated channel. So different types of stimuli are going to open specific types of channels, which ultimately result in varying magnitudes depending upon how much stimulus you have. And again, remember the example I used. I said you can poke yourself with your pen like this and you can feel it. But if you grabbed your pen and jammed it in your arm, do you think you'd feel it a little bit more? Yeah. All right. Now, remember, the signal traveling up to your brain is an action potential. But what we're doing here, where that stimulus is occurring, is the graded potential. All right? So it has two components to it. It has magnitude, which is going to be the strength, and it also has duration. All right? So I should put magnitude and duration. And so the longer the stimulus, the longer the duration. It's kind of easy. But it doesn't travel very far. It dies out. And in this next picture you can, well, I guess not. I guess the next slide has that. All right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's right. Right. So what we have here is, and what I was trying to describe, it's a two-part event. The graded potential, remember what I said, gives rise to the action potential. So when you step on the tack, what you've done is you've opened up mechanically gated channels that allow for sodium to come in. Now, in our little picture here, our stimulus is actually showing an axon. But let's put a needle at that point. And instead of having a gate there that's just kind of open, imagine that's a mechanically gated channel. And so when you cause deformation to the cell, that's going to open the channel, which is going to allow the sodium to come in. All right? So this region, this area that's depolarized, is temporarily depolarized. Part of the reason it's temporarily depolarized is because when the sodium comes in, it finds its opposite charge and becomes neutralized. And the other reason it's only for a very short period of time is because we have our pumps that take that sodium and throw it back out the cell. Right? So it's a very short-lived event. So short-lived that we can't actually conceive the short-livedness of it. I mean, if I told you it's like just a couple of microseconds, you'd be like, okay. You know, it's short. Right? It's dependent upon how long we actually, if I sat there and did that, you can see the duration portion, but that's just because we keep providing the stimulus. Now, because it dies out in such a short distance, it's very limited in terms of what it can signal for. All right? And so if you can't tell, I mean, here's our picture that we're doing. This is a stimulus that's occurring on part of the cell body of the neuron in that second, or in that little image. Or you can think of it being right up here. All right? And so as it travels, it only travels a short distance across that cell body. So you can see it's not a very good signaling event, because ultimately it would peter out. The way I kind of like thinking about this, if you can't visualize it, it's like throwing something into a pond, like a rock. When you throw a rock into the pond, the very first thing you see is this big splash, and then the ripples that move away from that point of splash get smaller and smaller and smaller as you move further and further away. And that's kind of the same thing that's going on here, is that the wave of sodium that's traveling through the cell diminishes, just much like a wave does in a pond. But here's the thing. If the stimulus is strong enough, it can travel quite a ways away. And so on the left here, what we see is a stimulus that is occurring up there at the triggering event. And as you move further and further away, and we're actually measuring at this point right here, then at this point right here, and at this point right here. And so what happens is as we move along, this stimulus is really, really high. You can see by this point it's kind of petered out. And by the time it gets down here to the axon hillock, do you guys remember what happens at the axon hillock? That's where you form the action potential, right? And so here you're at a point that's less than the triggering point, or what we would call the threshold for the formation of an action potential. So a weak graded potential does not give rise to an action potential. It dies out long before it can. But if you have a much stronger signal, come on pins, there we go, that can travel down through the cell and arrive at the axon hillock and be above threshold. If you're above threshold, you can get an action potential that can then result in an action potential that can then travel down the axon to the axon terminal. So what you say? Well, this is how we communicate from one side of the cell to the next. All right? Maybe. Yes, of course I can. Yes. So, part of the reason why we learn the graded potential is because we're going to see these terms: postsynaptic potential, receptor potential, in-plate potential, pacemaker potential, slow wave potentials, blah, blah, blah potentials. You're going to see these over and over and over again, okay? And they're just graded potentials. Just because they have fancy names doesn't make them any different than what we just described here, okay? In fact, we are going to learn about this one today. The rest of these, not so much. This will all be in the next unit. So that leads us to the action potential. And the action potential, as we said, was a brief, rapid, and large depolarization event. In fact, it's such a large depolarization event that it's actually a 100 millivolt change. And you can see down here, minus 70, go up to plus 30. All right? So that's a 100 millivolt change. And what we're doing is we're literally reversing the polarity inside the cell. It's kind of like Ghostbusters. No one's going to get that joke. It's just, my joke. All right? Now, what happens is a lot of people will look at this graph and they're trying to figure out what it actually means. But really what this graph is, if you can imagine, is that we're looking at a single point on the surface of the cell. And we're looking at that point right here. And then what we're doing is we've got our probe in that point and we're saying, what does the voltage look like inside the cell? And so we're saying over time, you can see at the bottom of the graph, over time, we're starting off at rest. And then what's going to happen is we're going to see the membrane potential change and actually reverse itself. So the inside of the cell is no longer negative. It becomes positive. And then it's going to return back to its negative form at that single point. It does so over time. I like to think of this like the wave. And for those who've taken my courses, you know what's coming next. We get to do the wave. Oh, come on. This is fun, all right? Now, the thing about an action potential is once you start it, much like the wave, it can't be stopped unless you think you're too cool for school, at which point we'll keep doing it until you get it right. All right? It's also propagated in what we call a non-decremental fashion. So when the graded potential was dying, we're seeing less and less and less. That's, decremental. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Decremental can go the other direction too. It can become bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not what happens. With an action potential, once you create it, no matter where you go along the length of the axon, it's always going to be a 100 millivolt change. It's always 100 millivolts. All right? So you're going to see it as it's traveling that it's just the same thing all the way along the length of the cell. The last thing that I want to point out is that you're either going to respond to a trigger or you're not. It's an all or nothing response. So if you can bring the cell to threshold and form an action potential, then the action potential occurs. If you can't get to that threshold, it isn't going to happen. So in order for you to get an action potential, you have to have enough of a stimulus that it results in reaching the threshold. Okay? So there are 5 basic events that actually occur. And I think we have like 4 or 5 slides here that basically say the same thing. We're just going to kind of walk through them. All right? So here at number 1, that's our resting membrane potential. So you can imagine yourself, here's the rest. The cell's not doing anything. And then what happens is there's some sort of stimulus that results in us moving away from the resting potential. In other words, we've got to do something that allows for sodium to come into the cell and cause depolarization. As sodium moves in the cell, the membrane potential goes from minus 70 and it starts climbing upward. Now, when you get to the number 3 up there, that's when you reach threshold. And at this point, what you've done is you've opened up all of these sodium channels in response to the sodium actually rushing in. So the type of channel you're actually opening is a voltage-gated channel. And we're going to go over this again and again, so if I feel like I'm talking fast, bear with me. All right? And then what happens is you see this massive chute, and that's number 4. That's the sodium rushing into the cell. Now, I've got to pause here for a moment. The terms I'm using here, like rushing into the cell, doesn't it feel like there's like a lot of molecules moving and it feels like a stampede? Yeah, it's all hyperbole. I mean, we're talking 1 or 2 molecules. Okay? It doesn't take a lot. But I want you to get the sense of how quickly and fast it rises up. And then at number 5, those sodium channels that are open slam shut, and then potassium channels open up. And this allows for the rush of potassium out of the cell, and it causes our return back towards our resting potential. But much like you trying to slam on your brakes when the light turns red, and you're like right there, and you see the policeman, you hit the brakes, you kind of slide a little bit past where you're trying to stop, and that's what happens. You overshoot, or really it's not called the overshoot here. It's basically you are hyperpolarized below your resting potential. And at this point, you're going to slowly see the ions moving back and forth as a result of ions moving through the leak channels as well as through the sodium-potassium ATPase pump to bring you back up to rest, which is 8 and 9. And now at 9, we've returned back to rest. Yes? What's that? Yes. All right. Well, they're passive in the sense that we're not using energy to do this, but we do have to have some sort of stimulus and some sort of thing to open channels. And that's what we're going to walk through. Now, just to demonstrate, to see what we're actually talking about, we need to do the wave. All right? We have to do this so that you can see what's going on here. All right? So, we're going to start the wave on this, and I always start over there, but we're going over this way. You guys know how to do the wave, right? So, here's the stimulus. Do you see that? Wow. See, it propagated, right? Once I started over here, it just went the whole direction. Woohoo! All right. Now notice there were some specific points about doing the wave. Everyone started low, and then we all went to our utmost highest, right? Going, woohoo! No, I mean, I know a couple of you said, oh, I'm going to pretend. But, you got to here, and then you brought your hands back down again. And how much did that look like what we just saw? I mean, did that look like this? Hands in my lap, hands way up in the air, hands back down in my lap again. Man, it's a wave. And if we focused on a single person and said, now we're propagating the wave and we're pretending like the wave's coming along and here it comes, and there it goes. And do you see? That's all we've done is we've looked at that single point. Right? You're in the splash zone. Remember, I'm Shamu. All right? So what we did was we just watched at that single point, and that's what that graph represents. Now, in order for this to happen, remember I pointed out that we have sodium and potassium. So the big players in all this are sodium and potassium channels. But they're a specific type of channel. They're not leak channels, they're voltage-gated channels. And so they open in response to changes in the membrane potential. Kind of cool. All right? Now, when you look at these, they're actually a little bit unique, all right? They have several charges, groups around them, and so when the ions start passing through and start changing the membrane potential, that's why they change their shape and why they're able to open up around them. Now, we have to kind of talk about these because in understanding how these channels work allows you to understand why we get the type of activity that we do. And if you look at the voltage-gated sodium channel, you'll see that there are actually 2 gates here. All right, it's not 1 gate, it's 2. All right, we have what we call an activation gate and another one that's called an inactivation gate. When we start off, the activation gate is closed, the inactivation gate is open. It's like this. All right, so when we stimulate the opening of the sodium gate or the voltage-gated channel, we open up the activation gate so sodium can rush through. But at the same time that we open this gate, we begin closing the inactivation gate. The difference is that this gate is slower than that gate. So it's like this. It's like up, and so sodium can sneak through before this one closes. No. Activation gate is closed at the start. The inactivation gate is open, and so when we open the activation gate, the inactivation gate begins to close. So what that means is that we actually have three states in which we exist. We have a closed state but capable of opening. We have an open state, and then we have a closed state again, but needs to be reset or incapable of opening. And so what you have to do is you have to go through all three steps. So we go from A to B, A to C to D. I don't know why it's screwed up like that, but whatever. And then we can't go back to C. We have to go all the way back and reset to get us to start the whole process over again. All right? So it's like this. We go 1, 2, and then 3. And then you have to go all the way back to start the process over again. Does so naturally, just by virtue of the change in the shape. Yes? That's a good way to think about it. It's a 2-in-1 event. And actually, here's the thing that gets most confusing. All the things we're going to talk about occur all at the same time. They all have different speeds, and so that's why they appear that they happen at different times. All right? But we'll bear with that in just a moment, okay? Or we'll deal with that in just a moment. So when you open the sodium voltage-gated channel, or the voltage-gated sodium channel, at the same time you're closing it. It's just that the closing occurs slower. That make sense? Kind of? Okay. The potassium channel is easier. It has one gate, so it exists in two states. Open, closed. Okay. Now we need to walk through the events to understand what's going on here. All right. So when we're at rest, both of these voltage-gated channels are closed. Does that mean that sodium is not leaking through? No. Sodium's still leaking through the plasma membrane. Is potassium leaking through the plasma membrane? Yes. All right. But remember, we are at equilibrium at that minus 70. So no sodium and potassium can pass through these closed channels. All we got to do is figure out a way to open them. All right. Now, the majority of these channels, these sodium-potassium channels, are localized to the axon hillock. There's some throughout the cell, but most of them are found at the axon hillock. And so what happens is you can imagine we're going to get some sort of stimulation, say at the dendrite, which causes the movement of sodium into the cell, which then opens up some voltage-gated sodium channels. So if I'm opening up more voltage-gated channels that are sodium, does that mean more sodium comes in? Yeah. So what happens is sodium is leaking in. Well, let's see. I guess I'm kind of jumping the gun here. What I want to kind of get at here is that, remember, when we talked about this, we had very few sodium leak channels. There was like, for every one of those, we had about 50 of those, or 75 of those, depending on which book you want to look at. And so the membrane is dominated by potassium moving out versus sodium moving in. Time out. All right. So here we are at the triggering event. That's where I wanted to be. So the triggering event, recall, is some sort of stimulation that allows for sodium to move into the cell. What happens is as sodium begins to move into the cell, it's going to change the membrane potential. In other words, we start slowly moving away from that resting potential. When you start moving away from that resting potential, you now trigger the voltage-gated channels. If you trigger the voltage-gated channels, you're going to open up more sodium channels that allow more sodium to come in. If more sodium comes in, you move a little bit higher away from rest. And you keep doing that over and over and over again. In other words, what you have here is a positive feedback event. Right? If I'm opening up sodium-gated channels, and it's sodium that's causing me to change my resting membrane potential, the more channels I open, the more that effect, or the greater effect sodium has on me moving up. Notice what this is. It's a positive feedback loop. And that's kind of what you're seeing. All right, so here's your depolarization. Depolarization results in opening up the voltage-gated sodium channels, which allows sodium to enter in, which causes more depolarization. And then around and around the circle I go. Threshold. you'll notice that everything that we're talking about actually results in some sort of significant change. So there's our second significant change, the threshold. Threshold is the point where you've opened up every available voltage-gated sodium channel. So once you've done that, now you're climbing like a madman, or a beast, or whatever you want to do. You're shooting upward. Sodium is rushing into the cell as fast as it can. Yeah. Inside of the cell. Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, so you can think about it like this. Here's my voltage-gated channel. It responds to changes in the membrane potential. So the presence of positive and negative ions as those. So as ions sneak through, fewer positive here, more positive here. Let's say it changes the opening. I should go like this now. Now I'm allowing more. It'll open up the next one, and the next one, the next. So what you're doing is you're seeing basically this accumulation of all these channels opening simultaneously to allow more sodium to come in. Is that the same thing that you're saying? Okay. Right. That's the positive feedback. It's more like an amplification event. Right. And so what's happening is by the time you're at threshold, what you've done is you've basically reversed the permeability of the membrane. So remember when we started everything off, we had the permeability of the membrane favored potassium moving out. And that's why I was at minus 70. Now what we've done is we've massively reversed it the other way. We've opened up so many sodium channels that we have more sodium moving in than potassium moving out. And so that's why we see this massive spike. And what are we trying to do? Remember what we said is that we could calculate where the equilibrium potential is. So sodium is basically trying to rush into the cell until it reaches its equilibrium potential, which would be plus 60. Now, that's not important for you. You don't need to know I'm trying to reach plus 60. But that's why you're shooting up, is because sodium is rushing in so fast that it's trying to get to the point where you'll get to rest. And then, and this is the time-dependent event, when you get right here, so notice everything started here, so when you get right there, that's the point when that inactivation gate closes. So what you've done now is you've basically reversed the permeability once again. Right? So you open up all these channels, sodium is rushing in, then you close all the channels, sodium can't rush in anymore. And if nothing else happened, then slowly but surely you'd kind of peter on down and get back down to where you started. But we don't peter on down. Instead, we rocket back down. And this is because of the presence of the second type of channel, the voltage-gated potassium channel. And if you don't see down here, if you didn't notice, we have a depolarization event that results in the opening of the sodium channels, but there's another arrow on our slide. It says the same event results in the opening of potassium channels. And this is a slower event. Remember I said things are going to open at different speeds. So the same event that causes us to open the sodium channels is the same event that causes us to open the potassium channels. They just open up later. And so they open up at this point. And that causes us to rush back towards rest. We repolarize. Now, a couple things happen during this period of time. We've closed the sodium channels, right? So they have the inactivation gate in the wrong position. So what do we have to do? Reset them, right? And then the other thing we're going to do is, by virtue of the nature of these channels, they're going to close back on their own. So potassium channels are going to slowly close as well. But they don't close all at the same time, because just as it took us a little bit of time to get to threshold, we're not opening everything simultaneously. There's kind of a lag. And so some channels are closing and some are remaining open for a little bit longer. And so we end up not just going here to threshold. What ends up happening is we end up overshooting our target, and we hyperpolarize while those remaining potassium channels close. And that's what brings us below our resting potential, why we're hyperpolarized. And then slowly, the ions will begin leaking back through their natural channels, natural leak channels. You have the sodium-potassium ATPase pump that's able to move the ions back and forth, and that will allow us to return back to our resting potential. Now, Has I said anything that's horribly confusing here? And I know that there's many steps. I'm sure I'm probably going to go over it again. But does it seem kind of simple and straightforward that there's just a couple of events here? That if you look at it, it's... We get rid of this ink. We basically have 1 event, 2 events, 3 events, 4 events. So there's 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Changing the permeability of sodium. Here, sodium dominates. That P stands for permeability, by the way. Permeability dominates. At this point, we're going to reverse. We're going to change the permeability of sodium, and we're going to increase the permeability for potassium. Here, permeability of potassium dominates, and then here, we're returning everything back to normal. But because we overshot, it's going to take us a little bit of time to get back to where we started. Does that make more sense? Yeah. Right, it never will. And the reason for that, yeah. So what it's trying to do, it's trying to go from minus 70 to plus 60, but it can't do that because on its way up there at plus 30, it's that time-dependent event. Remember I said it's opening, and so it's slowly closing. So by the time it gets to plus 30, that's when you slam the door shut. Right. It's actually talking about that plus 60. But it'll never get there. So what you'll see is you go from minus 70 to plus 30. And so just like when we did the wave, everyone's hand can only go so high. You know, presuming you're all the same height and your arms are the same length. All right. Right. That's exactly right. Sodium stops immediately. Yeah. Uh-huh. So from here so everything under here is a result of those potassium channels still closing. All right. So you can think about it like this. In order for me to get from, let me erase the ink on this slide, to get from here to here took a little bit of time, right? But those are depolarization events that ultimately result in the opening of voltage-gated sodium channels. But at the same time, those same events, those depolarizations, also result in the opening of potassium channels, right? It's just that the potassium channel doesn't open up until this point over here. So the one trigger right there that caused this channel to open there, this one is going to cause it to open right there, right? And so when this one closes, say at this point, this one over here is going to close at this point. So there's kind of this lag as a result of just things opening in a sequence. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's the well, it's not just passive because you still have the sodium potassium ATPase pump working here. But yeah, so what you've done is, remember, we established through using the Nernst equation and actually Hodgkin's, Katz, whatever, the stuff that we completely ignored, we established that the resting membrane potential of a neuron is at minus 70. So if you're not at minus 70, what's the neuron going to want to do? It's going to try to get to it. Yes, sir. That's correct. Right. So that's part of it. But remember, the leak channel's there because what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach that equilibrium of minus 70. The potassium is going to be moving out trying to get it to minus 90. It's just that we have that pump as well as the sodium leak channels that allow us to return back to the minus 70 itself. And I know I'm using numbers here. Remember, the numbers themselves aren't so important. It's what's doing it in order to get there. Yes, ma'am. No, so the cause for the trigger is the presence of a channel that responds specifically to that sort of stimulation. All right. And in English, what that means is that you have some sort of channel that has some sort of response, like a mechanically gated channel or a ligand-gated channel or a heat thermally gated channel, something that can detect a certain type of stimulation. And when that stimulation occurs, then that's going to cause the channel to open, which allows the sodium to come in. And then when the sodium comes in, that's changing the membrane potential, which results in the opening of the voltage-gated channels. All right? So it's kind of a two-parter, right? You would never feel... Well, let me put it this way. Anyone here like to eat really, really spicy food? Yeah, I mean, love it. Have you ever had a ghost pepper? No. Aha! Yeah, people are too scared. You should be. I mean, they are not fun. All right? You know, It's what people eat to prove how, I don't know. That's what I was going to go with, but I'm just going to keep that to myself. Yeah. Well, yes, but there's so much capsaicin that... Anyway, you put that ghost pepper on your taste bud, that chemical will bind to the receptor and cause it to open up. All right? And actually, those type of receptors actually respond to changes in temperature as well, which is why we perceive heat. Okay? So you can imagine that signal, the thing that we say that we perceive the heat on our tongue, is a result of a chemical binding to a receptor, allowing sodium to come in. Take that same pepper and put it on your arm. Are you going to feel anything? No. No heat, right? Because you don't have the proper receptor in place to cause the receptor to open up and say, oh, by the way, it's hot and you're burning here. In some cases, so you're talking, it can be whatever the stimulus is. All right, you want to talk about spiders crawling across the back of your neck? All right, what kind of, because, I mean, we've all done that, right? We've felt that bug and then start doing this. What is it? That's a mechanically gated channel, you know. Someone come up and poke you with a needle. You know, someone comes up and blows in your ear. I mean, all sorts of different types of stimulation. You know, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. That's your body in denial. No, I'm... No, so, I mean, part of that is that's, you know, the perception of pain, which we'll talk about in the next unit, and actual pain. In other words, the damage that the body detects are two different things. All right. For example, have you seen people walk? I mean, I know this is an aside, and we have about 1,000 slides to go through. But have you ever seen people walk across holes and they say, "Oh, I can't feel a thing"? Yeah. Okay. So you can tell yourself you don't feel anything, but I can guarantee you there are receptors on the bottom of your feet saying, "Damage, damage, 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 damage. Stop." All right. Or just as another example, anyone here like to run? I mean, like long distances. I mean, you get out there, you start running a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 4. I mean, it's fun, right? Yeah, you're lying to yourself. You know that runner's high? You know, those endorphins your body's producing? What is an endorphin? It's an analgesic. Your body's telling you, stop doing this, you're killing me. And I'm going to pretend like it's not happening. I'm going to get myself stoned. I mean, analgesic, morphine, yeah. All right. My point being is that perception and the stimulation that causes, you know, the damage, or I shouldn't say the damage, the activation of a particular receptor are two separate things. That's absolutely right. Right, exactly. That could very well be the case. Yeah. Is which the? Yeah, well, so that's the chemical that opens up the receptor to let us know that we have something hot in our mouth, right? And so those Schofield units, I think, are based upon. I mean, I know that's how you perceive heat, you know. So it's like, okay, well, this one's hot, but I think it's the actual concentration of the capsaicin that ultimately results in the actual heat. Well, capsaicin is a specific chemical that's found in pepper that results in activation of that particular receptor. They just bind to a particular receptor. But if you're talking about, if I put capsaicin on my arm, I'm not ever going to feel that. I don't have proper appropriate receptors. But can I go get a match and put it against my arm and feel heat? Certainly. There's thermally gated channels on my arm that can do that. So remember, when we talk about receptors, you have to talk about the specific thing that can actually activate them. They have a high degree of specificity to them. Yeah. Yeah, that's just so wrong. Yeah. Yeah. So again, you're talking about the proper and the appropriate receptors to actually detect certain types of chemicals. And so, I mean, if you actually get peppers on your hands, if you work with peppers for a long period of time, you're going to actually feel it as those molecules start penetrating and start activating thermally gated channels on your fingers. Anyone who's ever peeled peppers will know this. I'm sure no one in here has done it. See, I grew up in West Texas, and, you know, you've done it? No. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what it's saying, and I'm trying to interpret why the comma's in a place. Really, the way to stop the cycle is that What they're saying is that if you have a slower sodium channel inactivation gates, I'm not sure what they're saying there. I mean, I'm probably what it is my mind right now is racing on something else, and I'm just not. The words make no sense to me at this moment. Yes. Oh, I should remind you, if I don't cover everything, test is more detailed.
So when hot and cold are the same, that damage the receptor?
No, hot and cold are just variations in temperature, and so you're activating specific thermal receptors, which again is stuff that we'll talk about in the next unit, that deals with detection of temperatures within a specific range. All right. Remember, there's no such thing as cold. Cold is just the absence of heat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's literally the voltage because the presence of the charged moiety is on the molecule. And so, and what happens is like with most things where you change the shape, that are malleable, and again, malleable is not the correct word to be using here, but when you change the shape, it's in a configuration that it doesn't naturally want to be in. It wants to revert back to its original shape. And so there's a time-dependent resetting for all of these channels. All right, so when you start opening up the channels, it's a change as a result of the presence of those charges in response to the stoichiometry, I guess, chemicals. And then what happens is once you've now changed the shape, it's in a position that it doesn't want to be in, so it wants to revert. It wants to go back. That's right. All right. Now, I throw this up here just to remind you what I've said, is that we've only slightly altered the ion distribution. Even though I use these terms like rushing in and so on, this is hyperbole. It's not enough to prevent another action potential. All right? So a couple of molecules moving back and forth across the membrane to cause these massive changes. All right? So we're basically saying that the relative concentrations stay more or less essentially the same. So remember what we said is that like the osmolarity or the molar concentrations of sodium potassium, if we were to look at them through the eyes of the action potential, they don't differ. All right? It's 150 millimolar versus 5 millimolar. And it stays like that. Even if you have many, many action potentials and you do start making some changes where it'll be very slight changes, you actually have the sodium potassium pH pump to actually ensure that the concentrations really stay around that 150 millimolar and 5 millimolar range and 10 or 15 millimolar and 150 for each of the individuals. Fair comment or question? Yeah. Does that make sense? In other words, when you're thinking of these events occurring, don't think of them as massive changes to the microenvironments in the cell and outside the cell. Voltage changes are not big changes. We're not talking many, many molecules. We're talking very few molecules that cause these massive voltage changes. What this leads us into is the refractory period. And the refractory period, simply put, is the period of time in which an action potential can't occur. We have actually two parts to the refractory period. We have what we refer to as an absolute refractory period and a period that's called the relative refractory period. And again, I'd like to demonstrate the refractory period using an action potential at a single point. All right, you ready to do an action potential? I'm going to be the stimulation. You can just imagine we're just looking at the single point. Action potential. Go. Again. 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 Again.
Okay, I'm in my refractory.
All right, just keep going. Faster, 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 faster. Can you keep up? No. See, he can't keep up because even though the stimulation is coming on, the definition of an action potential, at least with regard to the wave, is that a true wave is all the way up and all the way back down. This is not a wave. That's a kind of dance, as you can see. All right? And so what we have here is a period of time in which you cannot do another portion of the wave until you've returned back to a point where you can come back up again. So the absolute refractory period is the period in time in which you cannot have another action potential. All right? And that's represented here during this period of time of climbing and returning back. All right? Now, there's a reason why it's absolute. And it has to do with the nature of the channels themselves. If I open up all the channels and I'm allowing all the sodium that can possibly rush in to rush in, can I make more sodium rush in? No. The rate is determined by how many molecules can go through each of the channels and how many channels I've opened. If I've opened them all, that's as fast as it can go. Right? So that would be absolute. Right? So on the upswing, if I'm... Sorry. On the I want to erase all and I want to go back to pen. On the upswing, when my action potential is going up, when I'm allowing sodium to come in, if I trigger to have another action potential, I can't open up any more channels. So I can't force another action potential to occur. Does that make sense? All right. On the downswing, just in regard to the sodium channels, remember we had two gates. One is called the activation gate, one's called the inactivation gate. When the inactivation gate closes, we have to reset the whole system. So on the downward slope, if I get another action potential, I can't open channels that aren't capable of opening. So I have to wait till those channels actually reset themselves before I can reopen them. And so the period of time that takes place, and this is again based on the cartoon, is that period right there. Similarly, let's think about the potassium channel. All right? Let's say I'm in that period of time where I am going to open, or I'm capable of opening sodium channels, but all my potassium channels are open. All right? So in other words, the degree of permeability of the membrane is dominated by potassium. I don't have enough sodium channels to overcome that dominance. And so on the downswing, I have to deal with not only the sodium channels, but I also have to deal with those potassium channels. And it's only after a certain period of time where enough of those sodium channels have reset themselves and enough of those potassium channels have closed that I'm now capable of getting an action potential. And this leads us to the relative refractory period. Now, the relative refractory period is a period of time in which another action potential can't occur except, because remember the definition of an action potential is if I can bring the membrane potential up to threshold. Right? So here I am below minus 70. Let's just call it minus 75. Let's say the stimulus that caused me the first time to get an action potential was minus 15, or was plus 15 millivolts. All right, so I went from minus 70 to minus 55, which is threshold, and that allowed me to get my action potential. If I'm at minus 75 and I use plus 15 millivolts, will that take me up to threshold again? No. What do I need? I need more volts. I need to have a stronger stimulus. And so during the period of the relative refractory period, I need a stronger stimulus to get me to threshold. All right? So the purpose of the refractory period is really to limit the frequency of the action potential. Now this is important because of how action potentials are actually used. Remember what we said about the action potential. The action potential has a absolute size. It's an all or nothing response. You either get plus 30 or you don't at all. And if you don't get to plus 30, if you don't reach threshold, nothing happens. So how does the body distinguish between varying strengths of stimulus? In other words, if I poke you with the needle or I stab you with the needle, how does the body know the difference? I like that. I like the answer. More. I do. Because it's true. It is more. It's hopefully you're stimulating more neurons, so you get more of a signal. But the other is the frequency at which it sends the action potentials. So a small signal, something, a low magnitude stimulus will result in few action potentials, but a large stimulus or a large magnitude stimulus will result in many action potentials. Now we'll learn more about this a little bit later, but I wanted you to see that, remember, when we're talking about an action potential, because it has a specific height, that we have to use code in order for the body to understand or the brain to understand what that action potential means. All right? Put it another way, for those of you who are familiar with Morse code is basically dots and dashes, right? And whatever the combination of the dots and dashes gives you a message. Think about binary. What's binary? It's ones and zeros. I mean, our language is actually more or less the same thing. This just happens to be 26 letters in our alphabet. So the idea here is we're creating an alphabet for the body to understand. It just has to do with the number of action potentials and what that means. And I'll get into that in more detail a little bit later. Oh, well, look, that's what it says right there. I knew this slide was in here someplace. That's what this is trying to show you. There's a weak stimulus, and you see, okay, there's a series of action potentials, and so you're going to get few action potentials, but if you get a stronger stimulus, then boom, 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 you get more action potentials. Each one results in different responses. You get a little bit of neurotransmitter in this case. You get lots of neurotransmitter in that case. All right. The other thing you can do is, like I said, you can recruit more neurons. So more is the answer. If you get a strong stimulation, you're going to do more. More action potentials and probably stimulate more neurons. Now, the action potential is conducted along the length of the axon. It initiates at the axon hillock, just as we described, and then it's going to be propagated down the axon. And it does so in a decremental fashion. In other words, what it does is it follows a real simple thing. As I have membrane, I'm going to cause depolarization along the length of that membrane. I'm going to move in a single direction because in that area behind, I'm leaving behind those channels that are still stuck, right? In other words, the ones that are closed that need to be reopened, and the potassium channels. And so that's why we go in one direction, because we're leaving behind a region in refraction. Now, this is a question I sometimes throw on the exam. Some of you will get it, some of you won't. But I'm just going to ask you to think about this for a moment. What happens if in a laboratory setting, because this can happen in the body, if I take a neuron and I stimulate one part of the axon over here and another one, so I create action potential that travel towards one another? They'll stop in the middle, because each action potential following it is a refractory period. So they just stop. Good answer. A+ on the test. That's what I'm looking for. I want all of them. I want all A+. As much as I hate writing letters of recommendation, I'd be happy to do 221 of them at the end of the semester. Just saying. Now, I throw this graph up here just to demonstrate this is like a snapshot of the wave in action. All right? So if we said, do the wave, and the wave was traveling through, and then I said, took a picture, we'd see some people like this, we'd see the people looking and waiting, and their hands would be here, some people would be down here as we're looking. And that's all we're doing in this little picture here. So if you can't visualize this, don't worry about it. It's just try to demonstrate an action potential in motion across an axon and kind of doing a freeze frame. Now, there are two ways to propagate an action potential down an axon. We use two different methods of propagation. We have what is called contiguous, which should be easy to see because it looks like continuous. And contiguous really literally means that. It means I'm going to spread the action potential along the entire length of the axon. In other words, I'm going to cover the entire membrane. And then we have the second type, which is called saltatory conduction. And what happens is we're going to be jumping the action potential along the length of the axon in these small regions called nodes of Ranvier, because we have myelin sheaths hiding the other portions of the membrane. Yeah. It's determined by the type of neuron you have. So you can say neuron tissue is dependent upon the type of neuron that's present, so sure. All right. Now, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's true. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. I want to kind of explain why we even have this. And then we're going to come back and we're going to look at a picture that's even more difficult to understand. No, it's the same thing. It's just poorly drawn. All of these are poorly drawn pictures. But you're all smart and you're all getting this. All right. So speed of an action potential is dependent upon two things. It can be the diameter of the fiber. So the smaller the fiber, The more resistance you're going to have, the harder it is to move things along. And so we want to make something go fast, we make a big, fatter axon. Problem is we have finite space in our bodies. And so if we were to make all our important axons as fat as they could possibly be to allow the signals to move as fast as they possibly can, our bodies would no longer be the sizes that they are. They'd be much larger, at which point we'd have to see a chicken and egg problem where everything gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It doesn't work that way. Does that make sense? Right. So what happens is that the body came up with a mechanism that just makes perfect sense. Why don't we actually insulate our axons so that we don't have to actually cover the full distance? And this is what the purpose of myelin is. And it's done by those two types of glial cells, the Schwann cell in the periphery, the oligodendrocyte in the central nervous system. And what it does is it actually creates a zone where the action potential can occur and creates these other zones where no action potentials can occur. And so what this picture tries to show you is what this myelin sheath looks like. And these are actually Schwann cells because they're easier. They individually wrap themselves around. And so it's kind of like this. I mean, if you can imagine a piece of chalk right here, which I know is a terrible example, is our axon, my hand wrapping around the chalk, and then my hand, there we go, and that's a myelin sheath. And what we have is a little itsy-bitsy, teeny tiny bit of space where action potentials can occur. And the space from here to here is just far enough that this area can then affect the next area, like so, and all the way down the line. Yeah.
Why not smaller and smaller neurons?
Well, because the nephron, with regard to the neuron, you don't want smaller because smaller is going to slow down the process. All right. The example I've tried to use in the past, but I don't know enough electronics, is like think about the wire that you use to power a stereo system. I mean, which type of gauge do you want? Do you want the big fat stuff or you want the itsy-bitsy teeny tiny stuff? Right. The fatter it is, the better it is. At least that's what they tell you, and then they charge you more. All right? Because there's less resistance, so that means the signals can move very, very quickly through the wire. And it's the same principle that's being applied here. So you're talking, what if we had shorter neurons? Well, then what you have to do is you have to think about this, is that between each neuron, there's a delay because we have to convert the electrical signal into a chemical, and movement of chemicals is much, much slower. And so it ends up really lengthening the period of time in between. All right. So what the myelin does, it serves as a way to increase the speed by keeping the axon small, but still allowing the impulses to travel faster. And the example here is 50 times faster. The other benefit to this is that it actually consumes less energy. And just to demonstrate that this is actually faster, I'm going to run a race here. We're going to race. We're going to race from here to the other side. I want you to walk normally. All right. Normal walking is going to be similar to saltatory conduction. I'm going to walk as if I was contiguous conduction. All right. Walk normally. On your mark, get set, go. Was he faster? Okay, let's try this again. Walk normally. Go. Now, did we cover the same amount of space? Yes, thanks. Yes. All right. But did he have to put his foot on every inch of tile in order to get to the other side of the room? No. He jumped over portions, literally jumped over portions. I'm jumping over the portion of the floor. That's the advantage of saltatory conduction. It allows you to skip over a portion of the axon, whereas contiguous conduction forces you to cover every millimeter of space. And so it slows down the rate of which you can travel. So the node of Ranvier is this area right here. Okay, all three of those. And that's where the action potential is occurring. The movement of the ions back and forth within that node of Ranvier is close enough to the next node of Ranvier that the action potential can be propagated and continued along along that line. So literally, that's what it does. It hops from one point to the next. Saltatory. Well, don't think of it as sensing. Just think of it as the opening and closing of those voltage-gated channels results in a change in the membrane potential, which then affects. There's no sensing involved.
They're not part of that positive feedback loop.
It is. So as the ions pass through here, those ions have to travel, right, which will cause a change in the membrane potential here, which will then open up these channels, which will allow more sodium to come in, so on and so forth. The difference is the distance at which it travels. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, when we walk like this, right? I mean, this is pretty normal. I mean, no one walks like this. I mean, this just doesn't work. You know, it has to be a short enough distance that our balance is maintained. And that's kind of what's going on here. There's enough distance that we're skipping a majority of the membrane, but at the same time, we're close enough together that those little areas affect one another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was confused about how the local ions would block themselves fluid because they're traveling inside the cell.
Well, they kind of are. They're just traveling down to, in terms of they're traveling to where there's a negative area. You know, and so, you know, obviously the first one that comes through are going to find a negative charge, and then the next one has to move further away, and so on and so forth. All right. So yeah, but see, what they're not showing you is that as the negative, positive charges move out here, you know, you're drawing positive charges away from areas, so this becomes a little bit less every single solitary time. Yeah, but because they're close enough to each other, they always will. That's the beauty of it. And this just summarizes that statement. It's always faster because it only needs to be regenerated at each of those nodes. All right? It doesn't have to be regenerated at each solitary millimeter or micrometer or whatever short distance you're thinking about for each of these neurons. Now, the whole reason we talked about this stuff, and let's see if I can do the last couple slides in the next 20 minutes. How many slides do I have? Like 40? 40 to go? Has to do with synapses. All right? That's the whole point of all this stuff, is to get to the synapse. Because remember, the purpose of the action potential is to travel along the length of the axon, come down the axon terminal to cause a release of a chemical that then affect the next cell. Cause a greater potential, which ultimately will hopefully cause an action potential, so on and so forth. So the synapse, simply put, is that junction between an axon terminal, should have circled the whole word, and the membrane of another cell. We term the cell that's on the giving side as the presynaptic cell, and then the one on the receiving side is the postsynaptic cell. Now, there are two different types of synapses that do exist. We have electrical synapses, and these are the ones where ions are moving back and forth between cells through gap junctions, and these are rather rare. Like I said, this is cardiac muscle, as an example. All right. Chemical synapses, on the other hand, is what we're looking at, where this action potential, this electrical signal, travels along the length of the cell, and then it creates a change, a release of a chemical. So it's a signal that travels the length of the cell so that something can happen at that terminal end. And that's when we release that chemical message that then can be passed on to the next cell. Electricity does not jump from one cell to the next because electricity is simply the movement of ions. And so what we're not doing is we're not taking ions and throwing them across the way. All right? Now, typically, the junction that we're going to be looking at is between a neuron and the dendrites of a second, but that's not the only way they exist. All right? It's just a simple model that we can look at. All right? There are three different types of structures where axons can terminate. It can terminate on a neuron, which is what we're going to be looking at, but it can also terminate on a muscle, in which case it causes a contraction, or it can terminate on a gland, in which case it causes excretion. And when it does this, we refer to this process as innervation. Now, if you look at the synapse, you'll see a couple of features. All right? This presynaptic portion right here is referred to as the synaptic knob. All right? And notice that the synaptic knob in our little cartoon has a whole bunch of vesicles. You see now why we started going over this at the very beginning? All right. The vesicles contain the neurotransmitter, which are chemical messages that we're going to be releasing. Notice also that our synaptic knob comes into very close proximity to, but does not actually touch the next cell. It's kind of like you and your little brother in the back of the car when you're growing up. I'm not touching you. You remember that game? You know? That's what's going on here. And so the postsynaptic side is going to be the receiving end. They're very close together, but they're not actually touching one another. And so this space in between, right here, in between those two, the presynaptic side and the postsynaptic side, is referred to as the synaptic cleft. The whole thing together is the synapse. All right. Now, as I pointed out, you can't throw ions from one cell to the next. So what you have to do is you have to convert the signal that you're receiving on the presynaptic side, the action potential, which is going to be traveling down, into some sort of chemical that can be passed on to the next cell. Because we know that the cells on the downwind side or the downstream side respond to chemicals. There's going to be receptors there that can bind to a ligand. All right? So what we have here really is what we would refer to as a unidirectional signal. All right? We basically have something that's causing a change in the membrane potential, which results in chemicals, which will cause a change in the membrane potential over here, which will ultimately cause a response. All right? The response here, which will be electrical, cannot affect this way. It only goes in one direction. Now, there are 5 steps to the synaptic event, and it's really simple. So, this is the easy part. All right? Basically what we have is we have an action potential that's traveling down, depolarizing, and it arrives down here at the axon terminal, and when it arrives at the end of the axon terminal, it's going to come across a new type of voltage-gated channel. So notice, the stimulus is a voltage-gated channel, and what it does is it opens up calcium channels, and calcium comes flooding into the cell. Calcium does what calcium does best. It causes vesicles to move to the surface. Now really, we're ignoring all the steps in there that it causes vesicles to move to the surface. But what it's doing is it's causing change in the activity of the cell. Kind of acting like a second messenger here. All right? And so those vesicles move to the presynaptic side of the synaptic cleft. It opens up, and out come the neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are going to diffuse out into the synaptic cleft, and those that come into contact with receptors are going to bind to the receptor, which causes the opening of a channel, perhaps, or some other sort of cellular response. So it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Action potential results in the opening of a voltage-gated channel, which allows calcium to come rushing into the cell. Calcium does its magic, causing a vesicle to move to the surface, opens up, releases neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter crosses the synaptic cleft, binds to a receptor, causes a change in the downstream cell. Yes, sir. Well, in this case, we're not describing what the event is, but I said it's kind of like a second messenger. All right. So how it's actually doing it, we're leaving it as the big black magic box with the question mark in it. All right. Now, I just wanted to throw this out here. I'm not going to ask you anything on this slide. I'm not going to ask you anything on this slide. I never have. I never will. I just like to throw it up here to watch people sweat. All right. But really what it points out is that all we are doing here is we have a neuron acting in a paracrine fashion. There are many different types of neurotransmitters. All right. And you can see there's all these different neurotransmitters listed here. You don't have to memorize them, please do not. All right? And or the neuron itself will release what are called neuromodulators. And these can act to cause long-term changes. We'll talk about those again in the next unit. It can also act as an autocrine signal, where it actually feeds back on itself, but we're looking at the neuromodulate or the neurotransmitter acting across the cleft. So the question is once we got this signal begun, how do we stop it? And it's kind of the same way we kind of did everything else. You've got to get rid of the activator. And so really what we do is there are several things. First, you can have enzymatic inactivation, which basically says, all right, well, here we've got this sucker out here. We don't want it here, so let's go ahead and start destroying it. So, for example, one of the neurotransmitters in your body is acetylcholine. There are enzymes called acetylcholinesterase that can actually destroy the acetylcholine. And you can see why, or if you think about it, you can see how quickly and how important this is, because when cells are communicating, you want them to be able to actually communicate with each signal. right? If you have an action potential occurring every millisecond, you want to be able to clear the path between those milliseconds. Does that make sense? So that's what you're doing. You can transport these molecules back into either the neuron or into glial cells, like the astrocytes, in which case they can either be destroyed or they can be repackaged and used later. The third thing they can do is they can be kind of like a, freshman walking around on campus and just kind of wander around and ultimately get picked up and move away, at which point there's no receptor for that particular neurotransmitter, so it's not going to do anything, and eventually it will get destroyed just by virtue of what it is. Yeah. Yeah, it would be a selective uptake of the neurotransmitter. Absolutely right. Now, I throw this up here, again, it has to do with speed, and so obviously if you are binding directly to a ligand-gated channel and you allow for the movement of ions, that's going to be pretty quick. But if you're binding to something that has a pathway in it, that's going to be a lot slower, right? So channels are faster than pathways, but either of these two things can actually occur, right? So we refer to this as a fast synapse, this over here is a slow synapse. The thing is when you're dealing with fast versus slow, fast synapses also last very short, whereas slow ones last longer because of the pathways. Now, we are now, with about 7 minutes to go, on the postsynaptic side. All right? So remember, we started on the presynaptic side. We sent our neurotransmitter, so now we're over here. All right? And we're going to try to establish what our response is. Hint. It's a graded potential. Okay? So we've come full circle, back around. All right? We have two different types of synapses in our body. We have what we refer to as excitatory synapses, which is how we always think of synapses because we think of things being turned on. But we often forget about the other one, which is the inhibitory synapse, where we're turning something off. All right? So with the excitatory synapse, what happens is the neurotransmitter is being released. It binds to a receptor, which is usually associated with the channel. The channel opens up, and sodium rushes in, and we see a depolarization in the membrane. This is what we call an excitatory postsynaptic potential, or abbreviated EPSP. Notice there's nothing difficult in the name. We named it for what it is. Excitation, because we're getting depolarization. And where is it occurring? Postsynaptic side, and it's a potential. All right? Now, because it's a graded potential, the stronger the stimulation, the stronger the magnitude. So we can have variation in the magnitude. It has absolutely no refractory period. That's one of the benefits of a graded potential is there's no refractory period. You can have them add on top of each other. So we can sum EPSPs together. The opposite is the IPSP, which is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Here, the neurotransmitter binds to a receptor that opens up a channel and allows potassium out of the cell, for example, or chlorine into the cell. In either case, what you're going to do is either you're going to remain flat at the resting potential, or you're going to see a dip or a hyperpolarization on the postsynaptic side. We abbreviate this the IPSP, the inhibitory postsynaptic potential. Again, same rules apply. Varying magnitude, you can have no refractory period, and you can sum them. I want to see why I had that there first. Now, in order to understand the significance of these things, we kind of have to understand how the nervous system is. Remember what we said is that it's a network of highly organized cells, and so these neurons can actually exist in two different ways. We can have cells that are in divergent pathways where you have a neuron affecting other neurons which affect other neurons and so on and so forth moving down the cascade. But similarly, you can have neurons that exist in a convergent pathway, and so both of these things can exist simultaneously, but you can imagine you have a neuron that's affected or acted on by multiple neurons simultaneously. And by thinking about how neural pathways are organized, it allows us to understand how our neurons actually respond, what we refer to as the postsynaptic response. A postsynaptic response, simply put, is the effect of all of these convergent neurons on a single neuron. Some of them are going to be excitatory. Some of them are going to be inhibitory. All right, let's put it this way. Ladies, imagine for a moment you go on Facebook and you announce to all your friends that there's this guy that you're dating and you want their opinion. So all 364 of your friends are going to respond and give you their advice in a yes or no fashion. Okay? Should I date this guy? 75% of the girls say no, 25% of the girls say yes. What are you going to do? You're going to say no. Well, that's a postsynaptic response, in essence. All right? You have a neuron, you have all these neurons converging on it, each of these neurons sending a signal, causing EPSPs and IPSPs, and the sum of those positive depolarizations and some of those negative hyperpolarizations will be summed together, and if you have a signal that's strong enough to create an action potential, you get an action potential. If you don't, nothing happens. All right? This is a result of summation. And what we have here is what we refer to as the grand postsynaptic potential, another alphabet soup, GPSP, which is the EPSPs plus the IPSPs. I know it makes no sense. All right? Now, temporal and spatial summation shows us how we're able to add these two things up. And in their names, it tells you how to go about doing this. Temporal means time. All right? So here we have a single input. You see the single axon acting on the neuron over here. What we do is we have a stimulus X, causes an EPSP, causes a depolarization event, and then we have another stimulus X2 that occurs a couple of milliseconds later that causes the same depolarization event. Nothing happens. But if we can bring both of these stimuli closer together in time, they can add up and get us over threshold. All right? Terrible example, but look at my hands. Clap, clap. Not very loud, but if I can get both those claps closer together, it's a little bit louder. All right? Terrible example, but you get the point. That would be temporal summation. The same signal or a successive firing. So it's one axon, multiple stimuli, closer together in time. Now, I point this out because spatial has a time component as well. Spatial summation is the simultaneous firing. So when you fire two synapses or more at the same time. All right? And you get an additive effect. Just as an example, we're going to clap again. Here's me clapping. Here's him clapping. Let's do it again. 1, 2, 3. Is it louder? Yeah. It's like why whispering, when everyone's whispering at the same time, it sounds like the room is on fire. All right? So here, we're using multiple presynaptic inputs that are occurring at the same time, resulting in enough stimulus to hopefully bring us to threshold. And the last one, simply put, is just cancellation, which by its definition you should make sense, is if I have an IPSP and an EPSP, one that's positive, one that's negative, their magnitudes can cancel each other out. Right? And so in this case, the additive event is that even though it's simultaneous, because the two things' magnitudes are opposite, the sums are canceled. I know I have time that you all are desperately trying to get out of here, but this is one that you should know. This is the presynaptic inhibition. Is this the last slide? What's the last one? No, we won't do that one. It's important to know, but, well, I'm not going to put it on the test for y'all. All right, presynaptic inhibition is a little bit different. All right, and it tells you in the name what it's doing. I'm inhibiting or I'm facilitating before, at the front end of the synapse, the presynaptic side. So this is not an IPSP, this is not an EPSP. What we have, so for example, here we have an action potential that's traveling down this membrane. All right? It gets down to the axon terminal, it starts releasing neurotransmitter. But because we have another inhibitory neuron acting on that axon terminal, we are inhibiting the release of the neurotransmitter. We're acting on the presynaptic cell and preventing it from doing what it's supposed to do, even though it was stimulated to do what it was supposed to do. So, so what we're doing is, ECOP. So what this cell is doing is that it's causing an EPSP or an IPSP there that blocks its activity. All right. Actually, in this case, because it's negative, it would be causing an IPSP. That's right, because this cell right there is negative. Don't worry about it. But do you see what we're? Do you see what we're getting at here? Is that you're not relying on the signal being positive or negative here within this synapse. It's actually affecting at the presynaptic cell, which is why it's called the presynaptic inhibition. Or if it were acting in a positive fashion, it'd be presynaptic facilitation.
Oh, no, I couldn't understand a word you were saying.
Yeah, so it's different. So when you see that, don't think, this is like an IPSP. This is flat out negating whatever the signal was supposed to be. Well, you can think about it this way. If I have presynaptic input, and if I'm facilitating, I make this one fire regardless of what's happening in the cell itself.